2025, everything has changed. The world has changed, and how we view money has changed.
Supporters of the digital currency are hoping the president's promised golden age extends to them.
We can't afford to keep navigating life with the same outdated paradigms that existed 50 years ago.
Go to school, get a job, and work hard. You're going to pay taxes. Why? Because you work for money.
And no matter how hard you work, no matter how much your time is worth, exchanging your time for money simply does not work anymore. And when we understand the key wealth creation principles, we'll realize that money is not what it seems. And the only way to keep up and actually create wealth is with only one thing. And that's when you understand money and you understand leverage. I'll be quite blunt right from the beginning because I don't want to waste your time. Because you see, time is the most precious resource that we have, and it's non-renewable. In fact, as young men, it's really difficult to understand the concept of time because we think we have all the time in the world. We always think we can work harder, we can optimize our routines, and we can keep building more and more meaningful relationships. But no matter what you do, time will never come back. And my intention with this 3-part series is to truly understand how valuable your time is. Because right now, if you're working a job, making $2, $5, $10 an hour, or even working as a big hotshot lawyer making $300 per hour. The truth is, right now, you're probably wasting the most precious resource that you have, your time. Even if you're working your whole life to work your way up the ranks at a prestigious corporation and you finally make it to the top of that hierarchy, the upper levels within big respected organizations, you will still be wasting your time even if you have a high salary, even if you have the respect, even if you have the job stability. And let me be clear, I'm not taking merit away from lawyers, doctors, engineers, or any other profession. That is not my goal with this. Because even myself, in fact, I went to university for 6 years to study my dentistry degree and graduate as a doctor. And it would be foolish of me to talk down upon the career path that I chose because I actually am thankful for the time that I spent at university. Once I realized the truth on how the world works, once I understood the truth about how money works, I could never go back to just being a dentist or exchanging my valuable time, my life, the most precious resource I have, in exchange for money. Because I saw what was on the other side and it hits me. If I continue down this path of exchanging my time for money as a qualified and respected dentist, I would still be wasting my time because it's not enough to play in this day and age. And I'll explain to you exactly what I saw and exactly what I understood from the other side. Because there's nothing wrong with gaining knowledge. There's nothing wrong with going to university or getting a prestigious job. In fact, it's a very noble thing to do. That is not the issue. The issue is how you make money if your goal is freedom in this day and age. Because in the end, no matter how hard you work, no matter how many hours you work, no matter how much your time is worth, you will always be exchanging your time for money. And therefore, when you are exchanging your time for money, you can never be truly free. Because the moment you stop working is the moment you stop earning. And I can say that because I work only 2 hours per day. And with that level of work, just 2 hours per day, I'm still able to consistently generate multi-7-figure income for myself every single year. And the reason I do this is because I see money different to you. I don't see money as something I gain by exchanging my time for it, but I see it as something far deeper. And that's when you earn money with leverage. And this concept, by the way, goes way beyond just the latest hot trend, the latest hot business model. This is not a get-rich-quick scheme. This is a wealth creation mechanism, and leverage is the only way in this day and age that you can afford to keep up. Because in case you didn't already know, money is not what it used to be. The history of money has evolved and the ways to create wealth has simply just changed. Most people see wealth creation from an outdated paradigm, a paradigm that worked 50 years ago, but no longer works anymore. And so today, in the first episode of this series, I want to achieve something very specific. And that is, I want to completely shift your paradigm to understand what money actually is. And how, without realizing, if you're operating under the old paradigm, you're actually screwing yourself, and then what you need to do to fix it. And with that being said, this is the Profit Paradigm Shift. Before I begin to explain to you the modern economic system, how it came to be, and why money as you know it is completely wrong, we need to understand 2 key things before we begin. And if you don't get these 2 concepts straight from the beginning, I'm sorry, but the rest of this series just simply will not make sense to you. So I'm going to try and make it as clear as possible. First and foremost, the amount of wealth you create, the amount of income you have, is completely not tied at all to how hard you work. And even if you are working hard right now, even if you continue to work work hard for the rest of your life, as time goes on, you will start to earn negative money. As time goes on, your buying power and therefore real wealth will naturally erode and get less and less and less, even if you continue to work harder and harder and harder, because that's just simply how money works. By the way, here I'm not just talking about money printing and inflation. The problem is a lot deeper, because there are even more sinister forces at work that over time is making your money worth less and less, making your time worth less and less, and therefore making your life worth less and less. Money has now become a way of entrapping people, a modern form of slavery. And if you don't understand how to break out of this, you can go about the rest of your life working hard, exchanging your precious time for money, probably not even being able to afford a house, let alone accrue generational wealth. And by the way, this principle has been true since the beginning of time. This has got nothing to do with the matrix entrapping you. It's just that the game is so rigged. And once you start to understand that, you'll realize that the conventional way of creating money, the conventional way of creating wealth is simply outdated and no longer works. Let me just put it this way. If money was linked to how hard you work, then the hardest working people in the world would be the richest people in the world. The reality is those people that are working manual labor or construction jobs, those are the ones that actually paid the least despite being outside all day using their bodies for physical manual labor. And even if you think, well, I work in a great organization, I have a great position, I have a respected job, I am irreplaceable in my company, there are still things that are out of your control. That company might go bust, they might still fire you, and you can lose your income through external factors. So even a job gives you therefore a false sense of security. And then that brings me to principle number 2. You will only earn as much as you think you are worth. And I'm not talking about some la-la stuff, some law of attraction and manifestation stuff and how you view yourself, because the reality is no matter what I think, money is not just going to show up by itself. I'm just saying, how is it that some people in this world can work tirelessly for decades just to finally save up and afford a down payment for a property? And whereas there's other people in this world that practically do nothing, yet they can afford to buy an apartment in cash every single month. And that's simply down to how they view money, how they interact with money, and once again, how they understand and use leverage. And therefore utilizing leverage and its 5 forms to their advantage, as opposed to just exchanging their time for money. And in episode 2, I'll go a lot deeper into the types of leverage, the multiple forms, and exactly how to utilize it to your best advantage. What are the pros and what are the cons? But in this episode, I want to get a few things through your head. It's first understanding that money and price are not the same things, because that's the most frequent and direct way people interact with money, because they think wealth has something to do with price, and that means how you price your time. And therefore that becomes a problem, because that's how you view your money. You think, I worked hard, I worked X amount of time to earn that amount of money. My precious life is tied to the money that I have. And therefore you view life, you view your investments, you view your savings as a correlation towards your time. And you just simply think, if I only had X amount of money, then I would truly be financially free. And frankly put, that could not be further from the truth. That's why so many lottery winners eventually go bankrupt in just a year or two. They won millions and millions and millions of dollars, life-changing money, and they end up completely bankrupt in just a year or two, because price is simply a method of exchange. But wealth, that is a concept that goes much deeper. And that's why most people cannot even fathom the ability to afford one new apartment every single month. And yet in my life, with the podcast that I have, I'm speaking to people like this every single week. People that have understood the 5 forms of leverage. They have understood wealth creation correctly, and they are able to earn $100,000, $200,000, $500,000, $1 million, or multiple $1 million per month consistently. So now that we've discussed these 2 key concepts, let's now get into how the modern economic system works, how it came to be, and why money is not what you think it is. In fact, it hasn't been for quite some time now. And then lastly, the practical steps we can take to actually create wealth in this day and age. You see, to understand money in its current true form, like with many things, we have to go back to World War II, the birthplace of society as we know it. In regards specifically to economics and the markets, we can trace back the modern economy to the Breton Woods Agreement. Back when the World War was still raging on in 1944, 730 delegates from 44 allied nations got together in Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods to discuss the global monetary policies that would be put in place after Germany was defeated. A lot of crucial decisions came out of that meeting, including, for example, the creation of what today is known as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. But even when taking this into account, that was not the most important thing that came out of that conference. You see, at the time, as it has been for the majority of history, it was declared that the economic prowess of a nation was due to be determined by the amount of gold reserves they had. The United States, being the largest economic power at the time, as it still is today, held 2/3 of the gold reserves of the entire world when the agreement was signed. As you may imagine, this gave them a tremendous upper hand in the negotiations of this agreement in comparison to all the other war-torn countries in the conference. Therefore, they could probably lobby for their interests way more effectively. And so, the most important policy of the conference came to be the gold standard. 1 ounce of gold was to be equal to $35. This meant that the US dollar was now officially the world reserve currency, as it became synonymous with gold. All of this to facilitate commerce after the war. And now, in principle, all this sounds noble. The United States offers itself as a middleman in order to promote stability and facilitate transaction between nations at a time when the world needed it most. And this actually turned out to be sort of true. And that's why right after World War II came a prosperous period of rapid economic growth, and being at the center of it all, the US economy grew to massive proportions, specifically when compared to the rest of the world at the time. And this allowed them to help rebuild Western Europe after the war through policies like the Marshall Plan. Now, one could end the story there and presume everything turned out perfect. But as we all know today, this is just not the case. The economy today is not perfect, and even if money could literally be exchanged for gold at a fixed rate before, this is no longer the case. Prosperity is no longer the norm, as you might guess. So what did happen between then and now? You see, after all this prosperity, the US cemented itself as the world power, financially speaking. No other nation could even come close. However, in terms of political or military might, there was one nation that came very close, the Soviet Union. And as they had complete control over Eastern Europe and various other nations, and even had a nuclear arsenal bigger than the US, as you might imagine, this did not sit right with the most powerful nation on the planet. And that's why they became involved in various proxy conflicts with the Soviet, the Korean War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the reason why your money is not real anymore, the Vietnam War. Because you see, as powerful as the US was, they were still limited in some sense. Limited by, you guessed it, their gold reserves, limited by the fact that they had to uphold the exchange rate of $35 per ounce of gold. And the Vietnam War was the very first war that actually posed a challenge for the Americans because of how expensive it was. It turned out the US was not infinitely rich after all, precisely because they had to uphold the gold standard. And so, because they were the most powerful nation in the world, they took a simple decision. They decided to no longer uphold the gold standard. As easy as that.
I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold.
Now you might think that this would cause international turmoil because a lot of countries now, instead of having their reserves in gold, they had it in dollar. But who was going to go against the most powerful economy in the world? Who was going to say no to the great United States? And so, just like that, because the US wanted to fund an expensive war, the dollar was no longer attached to gold. Currency stopped being attached to something physical. Money, which was pegged to gold previously, was no longer real. Money was simply paper. During nearly all of human history, to obtain money, you had to do some sort of work. Gold has to be extracted out of the ground, as is the case with silver or copper. However, all of that changed in 1971 when Richard Nixon decided to take the dollar off the gold standard and the fiat currency was born. Money became a virtual commodity, intangible, not tied to reality. So this was the paradigm I was speaking about at the beginning of this episode that's now over 50 years old. Your money is not physically real. It doesn't hold any physical, tangible value, and has been this way for over half a century. Money is not gold. Money is now simply a means of exchange. Now, there are counter arguments like, oh, money is tied to the strength of the American economy, or money is tied to the value of petroleum because of the petrodollar and things of that nature. But the truth is that all of that is a distraction because money can no longer be exchanged for a physical counterpart at a fixed rate. And keep in mind, I say directly because of course you can buy stuff with money, but before you at least had a failsafe where your money was guaranteed to be converted into tangible gold. And now that failsafe no longer exists because previously, money, the physical paper, used to represent physical gold. It was just an easier way to transport. Instead of individuals have to go with gold bars, they could go with these pieces of paper, these IOUs, and then cash it in at the bank. Now, these same pieces of paper that are backed by nothing are simply pieces of paper. They are simply valuable because we agree they are valuable. And the moment that goes, there it goes as well. The money ceases to have value. Because if for some reason the economy shuts down and you can no longer use your dollars and everything becomes more expensive, I don't know, maybe because of some natural natural or man-made economic catastrophe? You know, the cough. Now what's that money worth now? It doesn't matter, because the point is it is worth less than yesterday. And this has been happening at an accelerated rate for the last 50 years since the US started printing money like crazy after the Vietnam War. This is how money and the modern economy works today. And it all started in 1971. The US, seeing it had no clear economic rival and nobody could keep it in check, just started printing absurd amounts of money to pay off its debts that were created because of the war, which ended up being a total failure for the US. And again, since nobody could keep the US in check and everybody had dollars and everybody owed money to the US, who was going to say no? And so this pattern repeated itself again and again with the wars in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, and most recently the war in Ukraine. And it's not just wars. The unsupervised printing of money has become common practice in order to solve increasingly more expensive policies like COVID aid packages. And in case you weren't aware, the US printed and injected $5 trillion into its economy during 2020 in order to keep itself afloat. $5 trillion. To put that into context, the entire GDP of the US in 2020 was 21 trillion, and they printed 25% of their GDP out of thin air. Because again, who was going to say no to the US? And just to compare, that's like you magically clicking your fingers and now suddenly having 25% more in your bank account. Now, of course, you can't do that, I can't do that, but the central banks can, especially if the justifications is to keep themselves afloat. And who pays the price of such money printing? Printing money out of thin air? The price is paid by, you guessed it, you pay the price, because the side effect of printing all of this money is that every time new money is printed, the money that was already in the economy, your money, is now worth less, because there is more and more money in the world, but the amount of valuable things in an economy stays the same. And this is why the value of your labor has gone down dramatically over the past years when compared to the value of capital. This is the reason why back in the day you could support a family of 5 with one single salary, and today people struggle to support just themselves. Bad economic and political decisions due to unchecked power. And this is not some evil scheme. It's simply the logical reality of the situation and the bad decisions that had to be taken to keep the farce of money afloat and keep this archaic money system alive. Yourself as an individual will not be recompensated if the economy goes down. And if that ever happens, you want to be prepared, because there is a saying, power corrupts. And absolute power corrupts absolutely. And this applies to people as much as it does to nations and institutions, because too much power leads to unintended corrupt consequences. And this unintended consequence of having a single economic powerhouse over the past century is money is no longer real. Because if you still have a sliver of hope in the system and still believe in the inherent good of the system, because after all, it was built with good intentions, but is this the best we have? Why did they switch to this system if the previous system was more stable? Again, like with most things in life, don't focus on intentions. Look at the consequences and then deduce the intentions. The reason they switched the system of money printing was because they wanted more control. Central banks, instead of wanting to be tied by a system that had to be standardized towards an exchange rate to gold, they therefore had rules that they had to follow. And this is basically what they achieved with tremendous success. They effectively create the money out of thin air, and so therefore can determine its worth. By printing more, the money is worth less and less, but the value of their assets goes up and up. And this is not just a US thing, by the way. Nearly all countries in the world today have central banks that follow and execute the same policy. And then again, all economies today are still tied down in one way or another to the US dollar and the United States. And what we can truly see around the world, in the markets, in policies, in foreign policies, in the petrodollar, with all of these things we can deduce that the US still dictates what every other country and economy does, and therefore what every currency is worth. So now, there's no point in feeling sad or resentful about this. This is just how the world is today, and these are the rules of the game. Because now, unlike when you first started watching this episode, you now know what is going on, and thus you can be more informed to take decisions. Because you know that money can be printed out of thin air, and its worth and value is getting less and less over time. But the fact that money is not physically real, or the system is different to what it used to be 50 years ago, that does not mean you cannot achieve wealth. You just have to change your paradigm of what wealth is, and therefore what wealth means in the modern world. Which brings us back to the present day. As with anything, there are more levels to this thing. We've just unlocked level 1 of understanding. But as I said before, fighting inflation is just the first boss. You also need to fight taxation, fight appreciation, and even if you beat those odds, your kids will keep fighting because there is inheritance tax. And so there is only one way out. There is only one way to achieve wealth in this day and age, and the only way to achieve that wealth is escape velocity. And in this series, I'm going to teach you exactly how. Most people, like myself previously, that no matter how large your income is, you're always stuck because you always have the golden handcuffs. The concept of the rat race has already been beaten to death. But that does not mean that it's not true, because people exchange their time for money with hopes that one day in the future that they'll have enough. The way most people go about this is they find a high-paying job, meaning a position that gives them a privilege to exchange their time for a marginally higher amount of money. This is precisely what I did when I operated in that previous paradigm, because that's why I studied to become a dentist, because I knew my hours would be worth more, and therefore I could exchange my time for just a little bit more money. And I thought, just like everybody else, that this was the path to success. A prestigious career that could give me a decent income. However, when I really thought about it deeply, it started to make less and less sense. If I was a dentist, the amount of money I could make would be directly tied to how many patients I could attend to, which was therefore directly tied towards my time. Not only that, I'd have to set up shop in a clinic or own my own practice, which would keep me tied down in one place while I made a name for myself and got a proper client base. And not only that, if I wanted to make really good money and get ahead of the average dentist, I'd have to work extremely hard to see more and more patients, which would eat away at my time. And even if I did that, even after making all those sacrifices of my time, I would still be taxed. My money would be worth less and less every year. Plus, after all of that, I would still be barely able to afford a house, and the only way that I would be able to afford it is with the help of a bank, and therefore I'd be tied down once again to a mortgage. And that's when I realized that that traditional career, the concept of exchanging my time for money, would give me a stable, secure life, but in no way, shape or form was it going to lead to me being wealthy or to have anything you can call your own, not even your time. And of course, I did want to be wealthy, but the normal life has its pros, because if I was a dentist, I would never go hungry. I would always be able to afford to pay my bills because I could always go and get a job. But fortunately, I realized early, while others go about their entire lives exchanging their time for money and assuming that would be the path to wealth. But as we can see, living like this will never build wealth, because the moment you stop working is the moment the money stops coming in, and it will only be a matter of time before you spend it all. Money is not wealth. The only true way to build wealth is not exchanging your time for money. The only true way of building wealth is through leverage. And this is especially the case now when the value of money is simply virtual. Now, when it comes to the new paradigms and understanding the power of leverage, that wealth creation can only come from leverage. You have to understand that there are many types of leverage that you could deploy, 5 types specifically, and each one of these forms of leverages has its pros and cons. And that's exactly what I'll be going through in the next episode of this series. What I hope you start to understand, and what I hope you start to see, is that wealth creation that comes from leverage has nothing to do with exchanging your time for money, because the fact of leverage is, with the same inputs you get greater and greater outputs, whereas with the traditional paradigm it's simply what your time exchanges for money, and it only grows marginally. It grows at a very small linear rate, nowhere near keeping up with the rate of inflation or the rising cost of everything in the world. Whereas with leverage you can keep putting in the same inputs and get exponential growth, get greater and greater outputs, especially when they start combining on top of each other. That's when you really have parabolic wealth creation, and that's when you get maximum outputs and truly reach that financial escape velocity. The way you create wealth is by utilizing one of these forms of leverages and using it to its maximum advantage. In the case of labor, for example, let's take something as simple as waiting tables at a restaurant. If 2 restaurants serve the same food, a restaurant with 1 waiter will not be able to achieve the same amount of sales as the restaurant with 5 waiters can simply serve more people. They have more leverage. A soldier, no matter how good he is no match for an army, because the army has more leverage. And that's why peasants were never rich while the kings were. The kings had armies and they could go and seek more land. Why? Because they had leverage. You might think that this is not fair, but this is how the world works, and fighting against it will just bring you more and more problems than if you just go with the flow and adopt leverage. If you just play the rules of the game instead of fighting it or using an outdated paradigm that used to work 50 years ago, but now with the value of money changing, now that it is no longer back to gold, now that the US and every single central bank can print this money out of thin air, you have to change your approach, because wealth creation, what was 50 years ago, is something that simply does not work. And if you don't adopt one of these 5 forms of leverages, you will be left behind, because your buying power, your money will just be eroded and eroded as they keep printing more and more out of thin air. Because as there's more money in an economy and the amount of goods stay the same, the value of the money simply goes down. Your savings, your income actually goes down. And as the saying goes, you can't make an apple tree give you lemons. No matter how hard you try try. And by the same token, you'll never be wealthy if you don't play by the rules of the game, no matter how hard you try. And the most important point you need to understand is that the rules are no longer the same as they always were. Most people think that freedom is something earned, and maybe that was the case before, but that is no longer true. Freedom is a choice to either start deploying leverage so you can achieve the life you want, or keep operating under the old paradigms where you just keep running in circles and circles. Because wealth is not about being able to afford a nicer car or a bigger house or working for a couple of years. It's not about measuring your material success as a comparison of how much time you had to spend in order to earn it. It's about knowing exactly what you have to do in order to maximize leverage, and thus being able to afford that car or afford the house in a matter of a concrete decision that requires little effort or time. This is the true path to wealth. And in the next episode of this series, we'll be diving deep into what leverage means, what the different types of leverage are, and the simplest path you can take to follow in order to start deploying leverage to reach that escape velocity and finally get out of the rat race and start building real wealth. And in 2 days' time, on the 24th of January, I'll be explaining exactly how to do that. So I'll see you there in part 2 of this series of the Profit Paradigm Shift.